Welcome to A Culture of Curiosity, a podcast delving into the school experiences of millions of children around the world. This is a curious podcast for educators by educators. And I'm Jack, a belonging and inclusion specialist.
And I'm Maureen, a former head teacher and now leadership coach and SEN specialist. We're talking all things inclusive education, creating a culture of curiosity around situations and dynamics that exist in every school, every day.
So whether you're a teacher, leader, or just passionate about creating schools where every child gets to belong, you've ended up in the right place.
So this week we are joined by two lovely guests, and having followed their work and working with them for a while now, it's so lovely when you get a group of people together that have such like-minded thoughts that really share a common set of values. So I'm really, really excited about this episode. So this week we are joined by Arti Sharma. She is the CEO at Nurture UK. And we are also joined by Dr. Suus-anna Harskamp. We've got to get the doctor in there. She's going to give me so much crap for saying that. And she's got a doctorate in resilience in education. So guys, are you okay to say hello, Arti? Can we start with you?
Hey everyone, thanks for having me on the podcast.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks Jack, thanks Maureen for inviting me.
You're more than welcome.
We've just been chatting about nurture, and that's going to be one of the big things we talk about today. Why we all need nurture, why every provision needs a nurture-led approach. Mo and I were talking before we started recording that what's really lovely at the moment is that there seems to be a bit of a building conversation happening where we're starting to think more and more about a nurture-first approach, where we're thinking about well-being, where we're thinking about mental health, and I think that's really, really exciting. So before we get stuck into that conversation, are you happy to introduce yourselves and just tell us a bit more about who you are and your work and how you sort of found yourself in this corner of education? Arti, is it okay if we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I've been at Nurture UK as the CEO for 5 years now, and I actually got the job on the Friday and the country went into lockdown on the Monday. So it's been a very interesting journey for me over the last 5 years. And I, prior to that, I was actually a trustee at Nurture UK. And when I became a trustee in 2018, I'd never heard of Nurture at all. UK, sorry, I'd never heard of the charity, and I was blown away by it because Nurture UK feels like it's a sum total of everything I've experienced personally as well as professionally. And professionally, I started off my career as a teacher, a primary school teacher, and I was one of those people, unfortunately, who left after sort of 18 months, 2 years. I loved teaching, loved education, but bureaucracy, red tape, not being able to support the children the way I wanted to, felt I couldn't really do what I wanted to do. So I ended up retraining into marketing and communications. And however, every job I did for the and have done over the last sort of 25, 26 years has had something to do with education, children and young people. So that's always been a sort of a drive for me. So when I discovered it, Nurture UK as a trustee, I was just like, oh my God, I cannot believe I didn't know about this organisation before. Absolutely fell in love with it. And when the opportunity arose, my predecessor was retiring, I thought, yeah, I will put my hat in the ring, so to speak. And I was delighted to be part of Nurture UK. So for me, seeing that sort of not knowing what it was and what I experienced as a child. So I was one of those children, we often say that I was a nurture child, and my father passed away when I was young. My safe space was literally broken overnight. I was a very talkative, happy child, as I am now. And overnight, I became very quiet, very inward, felt really uncomfortable speaking in public. I felt physically sick if a teacher asked me a question in class. I didn't really enjoy primary or secondary school at all. But so it's bizarre I became a teacher. And it's an amazing to be part of amazing charity, Nurture UK.
Thanks, Arti. Suze, can you tell us a bit more about what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate. I had a very happy educational experience. I did really enjoy school, and I want to say that I had my career mapped out, and I knew I wanted to go into teaching, and that was my life goal. But it wasn't. I fell into it a little bit accidentally, a little bit through, I need to find some money in my university summer holiday, and did some work in a special school for children with SEMH needs, kind of support assistant, kind of just being in and around. And it's that role, I think, that got me started. I absolutely loved that work. I loved the children. I loved the culture. I loved the way of understanding children and their needs. So I did that for a period of time. In a similar way to Arti, sometimes found the bureaucracy around not being a teacher a little bit frustrating, and thought, okay, I want to be in a system and change this. So I went through the teaching route, spent a number of years in mainstream, working with children who have split placements in specialist settings, alternative provision, additional resource provision. And again, really found that my space, that I felt I could see some impact in the work I was doing, and then moved into specialists. So I spent a number of years in a provision for children with SEMH, and then back into mainstream with leadership roles, safeguarding, pastoral inclusion, all that lovely stuff that I still feel very committed to. And then went into, I don't like saying behaviour support, but that's what the role was then. But this idea of, trying to support schools to support their young people in slightly different ways, or viewing things differently. That took me into mental health, because behaviour, mental health, the overlap we were really starting to recognise that. Decided to take on the doctorate, work with some amazing children who I will always be very grateful for. Completed that, and now a virtual school advisor. So really kind of focusing on the experiences for our children in care, or those who've previously been in care, and those known to social workers. So I guess really staying in that SEMH inclusion world. My involvement with Nurture UK, and I first met Arti, I think was about 3 or 4 years ago. I had already known quite a lot about Nurture UK through working in specialist settings, and happened to have a conversation with a friend who said, I think you should talk to them. And from the moment I kind of spoke with people at Nurture UK, I just felt this is absolutely embodying the kind of work that I would love to see more schools being supported to do. So that sits, alongside the work that I do now.
Brilliant. Well, lovely to meet you both, and thank you.
It's definitely time, Mo.
It's
time.
definitely thought tickle time. So we'd like to give you a thought tickle, that little question that we asked, to sort of try and see whether or not we are connected, whether there are things that our curiosity leads us to points of connection that we perhaps didn't know were there before. So I've got a thought tickle today. What's the most unusual or unexpected compliment that you've ever received? Did you want to go first?
Yes, I'm happy to. So I would say, unusual or unexpected compliment has been, I'm 5 foot, and that's a fact. And I always think it's very obvious that I'm a short person. And many times I've been in groups where we have a random conversation about height, and then I'll sort of say, "Oh yeah, and I'm 5 foot," and they're like, "Oh, I just see you as taller." And I find that really bizarre. So I always say, well, it must be my big presence then, because that gives me that extra height for some strange reason. But yeah, but it's that, I'm a short person, so that's my unusual compliment.
I'm only a few inches taller, and I know that feeling. Even my own siblings every so often turn around and say, I thought you were taller than that. No, I've always been. So I really connect with that one. And it's the absolute shock, isn't it, when people realise that it's possible to be an adult and be the size that we are. How about you, Suze?
So in kind of preparation for this, I started to look through some of the stuff that I'd kept over the years from children that I've worked with, and looked at their cards and old photos. And the unusual compliment actually came from one of my own children, was like, "Oh, that looks nice, Mum. You looked much younger then." I was like, "Oh, okay, thank you." But it was a really nice opportunity, actually, to using that thought tickle to get me back into that zone. So I'll take that. odd compliment.
The
I can't
power of children to just serve those compliments with a backhand is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, they say it as they see it.
Do you want to go next, Jack? Come on, what's the most unusual, unexpected compliment you've ever received?
So when I first received this compliment, I wasn't quite sure that it was a compliment, but it also came to serve me really well. So I used to work with a little man called Harry, wonderful, wonderful little man. And after a wobbly couple of months, we really kind of figured each other out and connected. And then as other people joined the provision and I was carrying on doing some work there, he kind of became what I felt was like a bit of a mediator. When we'd have new young people join us that weren't quite sure what to do with me, they weren't quite sure to how to figure me out. So the thing that Harry said was, he said, "Oh, Jack's all right. He's big and tall like one of those floppy tubes at car garages, but he's all right." I thought, great. But the problem was, is it became a bit of a kind of ritual every time I would have to show videos of these tubes to the kids that were going, "Oh, Harry's told us this. What's one of those?" It became a real thing.
Sometimes when you can't unsee something once someone points it out, that's now what I'm saying. Same.
Is this what you need from me,
So,
everyone?
Yeah, that's what you need to do.
Hey, you'll never
brilliant.
take me seriously again.
No.
So Harry was your official sort of Jack translator, was he? He would sort of explain your foibles and your quirks to everyone
Yeah,
else.
he kind of became a bit of a
Fantastic.
tour guide of, this place is really great. Take no notice of Jack. Don't take him seriously, but he's a nice guy.
It's so funny.
So what about you, Mo? What's yours?
Okay. Mine is medical. A few years ago, I was having an operation, and it was quite an involved operation. And there'd been sort of months almost of tracking back and forward to hospital for various tests and things. And to be honest with you, I was starting to feel a bit down about the whole process. So I went for a pre-op, and I sort of got moved from one department to the other, and I ended up with having some bloods taken. So I'm putting my arm out, and I think she must have, the nurse must have sort of sensed that I was just fed up. And she looked at my arm, she tapped it, she went, "Oh, you've got lovely veins." I just looked at her and I thought, it used to be my legs, it used to be my boobs, it used to be all sorts. Now I'm getting complimented for my veins. This is where I'm at. But it did brighten me, it did brighten my day.
I mean, as compliments go, it's hard not to take that a bit personally, but isn't
I
it, though?
know, I've got good veins.
See, the problem I've got now is all I'm wondering is what constitutes good veins? Do I have good veins? The things that bring us together, eh? Whether or not
Absolutely.
we've got good veins. I love this. I love this thought tickle thing. I was in a school a couple of weeks ago, and I was having a conversation. It was probably a very, shameless plug about the fact I was very excited about our new podcast. But I talked to them about this idea of a thought tickle, something that binds us together. And one of the staff I was talking to said, "I wonder if that's something that maybe we could do after lunch, something to bring the children back in, something to kind of bind us together, have a bit of a giggle." And I thought, what a beautiful, beautiful idea. And I got a text.
Fantastic.
I got a text from her yesterday saying that we did one. She's not told me what the question was yet, but she said they had this most beautiful 15-minute conversation. All the kids were really giggling. They had this really lovely moment of connection. And then she said, in terms of moving on to what they were going to look at in the afternoon, she said everybody was calm, everybody was regulated. And I
Mm.
thought, great,
How wonderful.
this is
That's
great.
brilliant. Our work here is done, Jack. That's
That's it. End the
fantastic.
episode. We can't top that.
From a physiological point of view, if there's the releasing of endorphins and all those kind of things that come from smiling and laughter, it's not surprising in many ways, is it? If that is helping some children, maybe not all, but some children feel like that sense of brightness or lift or calm.
I just think that handled in the right hands, that's just such a great tool, isn't it? And I know that our topic is nurture and that fact that we need nurture, but actually that's a form of nurture. It's a form of caring and looking out for somebody. Is that I'm interested in your answers and I want to know a bit more about you, sir. That's a great idea. I'm really impressed that she sort of picked that up and adapted it. That wasn't what I would have expected to happen. That's fantastic to hear, Jack.
No, it was really, really lovely. I've said that I'm going to go back and visit so I can take part in one of these thought tickles after lunch in the afternoon. So thinking about our kind of topic today, we're thinking about what do we mean by nurture and why does it matter? So maybe a question for you, Artie. Can you, for those that maybe haven't kind of found Nurture UK or haven't had this kind of conversation yet, could you give us an idea of what do we mean by a nurture approach in education?
Sure, happy to. So I think for us, nurture approach is a relational approach and it's rooted in attachment theory and child development. For us, we often say that it supports the social and emotional needs, development needs of a child and their ability to learn. So if we've got that bit right, then we're able to get them to learn. And what I find for me, what is the most important, it's not an add-on. It's actually something that's foundational and needs to be in every aspect of every school.
Absolutely.
And we all know, we often talk about it, that secure relationship supports brain development and emotional regulation. Many of our children coming into school may have faced adversity in some shape or form, affects how they behave, how they learn, how they interact. And nurture helps to rebalance that. For us, it's about that rebalance of all of those things that are going on for a child. And we as a charity have just been focusing on, at the moment, we're working in just over 5,000 schools and across the sort of 4 nations. And we're really trying to make that basics of understood that it's something that's foundational. It's not an add-on. I know there's a big sort of focus on academia and exams and results, etc. Of course, they're important and of course, they're very good, but actually focusing on the social and emotional development needs of a child is fundamental in able for them to learn. So, in a nutshell, I think that's what I would sort of say what nurture is.
And I love the example you gave of it being foundational. I think that sometimes we do have conversations where there's sometimes there's misconceptions offered that it becomes a kind of luxury add-on that first and foremost children come to school to learn. And while we're not disagreeing that children don't come to school to learn, I often use the analogy, and it's possibly a poor analogy because I've never built a house in my life. But if you didn't build your house on solid foundations, you couldn't then be surprised or frustrated when the house starts to sink and fall over. That feels like quite a logical kind of experience that we'd
Mm.
expect. But if we don't acknowledge what sits underneath that learning experience and what we've got to try to get right for those young people in really individual contexts, sometimes we can't then be surprised when they find the learning, the academic performance, that much harder to access. And we want children to have every opportunity possible, but sometimes they're not accessible if we don't have that foundation.
And it's not one or the other, is it? It's
No,
one
no,
linked to the other. They support,
absolutely.
one another. That we know that if we're able to support children's development in their social emotional world, that will impact on their ability to engage, to learn, to take risks in learning. But also, I think really importantly, in one of the principles of nurture is recognizing where children are in terms of their development, not where they should be, not because you're 15 you should be able to do this. It's the actually, where are you? You might be really academically capable, but there may have been some emotional barriers, some emotional interruption that means in some respects there is still some work for us to do. And I think going back to that thinking about what nurture is, and Maureen, you touched on it. If we're thinking about it in its most simple sense, as a noun or a verb, it's around the care and protection we can offer something whilst it's growing to help it to develop, to support its development. And actually, is that not the purpose of education? Is that not what we want for our children? So Nurture UK takes a lens of kind of 6 core principles that schools can think about that sits within, like you
Mm.
said, this approach of really thinking in that most holistic way about our children and our young people.
I just want I was going to say, I just want to add that it's not rocket science either. It's something very simplistic, but it takes time to embed. So you need to have that commitment to embed that. And that's how we work with the schools. The 6 principles of nurture are the basis of everything that we do in all of our training and everything that we work across the schools. But it takes commitment and And it takes time, but it's worth the effort to take the time to do that, because what we want is well-rounded children who are excited about being at school and excited to learn and are happy and confident and resilient amongst themselves, and they can access their learning. I think that's what nurture is about, and that's what we want to see more and more of.
That's great. Before we go any further, just for the benefit of me and the benefit of listeners who may not be aware, you talk about the 6 principles of nurture. Can you just very briefly say what those are?
So one of them is all behavior is communication. And I think that says it on the tin. So all behavior is communication. It could be non-verbal communication as well, your face expression, how you're sort of moving about. A child will pick up on that. So we also say the importance of nurture for the development of well-being for children is really important. So if you don't focus on that well-being, they're not going to be able to access learning, and that bit's got to come first. Language is a vital means of communication. Saying to a child, stop that, compared to why did you do that, is very different in terms of how they will engage with you and listen. The classroom offers a safe space. I think quite simplistic. The importance of transition in children's lives. From your own experiences from teaching, you must have seen, I haven't been a teacher for a long time, but the experience of the pandemic and that transition from going from year to year when you didn't see half of your schoolmates, or from class to class where you were in your own little bubble, or even from primary to secondary. So many children miss out on that supported transition. So we do a lot of emphasis and talk about the transition is really important. And final one is children's learning is understood developmentally. It goes back to what Suze was saying earlier. It's not about you're 15, you need to behave that way. It's very much, we often say stage, not age. What stage are they at in their social emotional development, and how can we help support them to move them to where they can access learning? So that's a sort of a summary of the 6 principles of nurture.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And again, you've just given me so many things to think about that out there. But I'm sure we'll get round to them, and we'll get through those. And on what we've been talking about just so far, the idea of people say, well, this is schools are places where children come to learn. And yes, I agree with everyone else. It's not a binary either or. And my response is, yes, they do. But some children come to learn physics, chemistry, art, and other children come ready to learn how to feel safe. It's still learning, and it's not an either or, it's a whole process.
I talk to schools quite a lot about that, Maureen. I think you've really touched on something there. In terms of curriculum development, our role is to fill those gaps. Okay, you're missing this skill in your maths knowledge or your physics knowledge. This is what I'm going to do to support you with that gap.
Yes.
But as soon as it becomes to let's say behavior, which we know is actually kind of a symptom of the emotion, we are going to that punishment route, not a teaching opportunity. So if something goes wrong, actually that is an opportunity to support that young person, to help them understand, to bridge that gap, to fill that gap. And I suppose I just want to add, from all the conversations we will have, this is never about a fluffy kind of no consequence route. It absolutely isn't. Actually, boundaries, high expectations, being supported to be safe are pivotal in the work that we're doing. So taking a nurturing approach for me, whether you're thinking about it from 6 principles because you already work with Nurture UK, whether it's because you're interested in nurture as a concept, that sits within there, that helping our children to be able to function within the boundaries, the rules. That's part of our role. It's not about saying we're going to ignore, what you've done because this has happened to you in your childhood. It's about saying, goodness, I'm going to be curious to understand what's driving this and how I can help you, or how I can help you to help yourself when you're finding these things difficult. And I think, just to add that nurturing approach, I think that for me that relational thing that we're all already talking about is really important, and that belonging, that connectedness to others is, we look for that as adults as well. If we think about our workplace, if we think about when we can thrive,
Absolutely.
it is not if we are feeling unsafe. It's not if we're feeling isolated, misunderstood. So some how we think about ourselves can be applied in education. It's about reducing barriers, whatever those barriers might be. It's about young people
Mm-hmm.
feeling included. And I think a really big thing, and I know, the cultural curiosity is that professional curiosity. It's that I won't take it for what it is. I want to understand. And just representation as well is really important, I think, for our children. Is that the saying is that you can't be what you can't see. Some of our children need to be connected to people that understand what they might be experiencing. And I think we talk about schools, but I think youth work is a massive part of the work that we can be doing for some of our young people in terms of taking a nurturing approach, because school models as they are now might not fit every child. However however we might try and mold ourselves, sometimes a different approach is needed, and that's okay. So I think it can, when we're talking about a nurturing approach, and part of the work we're doing with Nurture UK, it's school, yes, but it's our communities as well. How are we talking about this out in the communities?
I was just going to say, for me, it's all like going back to what you were saying, Suze, it's high structure and high warmth. I think that's what nurturing is about. There is a structure
I
around.
love that.
We're not removing the challenges, though. We're not ignoring those. But what we're saying is we're giving the children the tools to be able to manage it. So we don't directly, Nurture UK doesn't actually directly work with the children. We work with the adults who work with the children. So we're giving them the tools and how they can support their children. And it's about co-regulation and self-regulation over time. That's where we where we wanted to get to. And once they get to that bit, they'll be able to access their learning.
Absolutely. I used to say when I was a serving head, there were a few things that my staff knew I was very broken record about, and the concept of consequence was one of them. And I used to say, look, consequences need to be given in sorrow, not in anger. You need to get everybody to the point where there is true reflection, true understanding, and only then will anything that you want to bring in as a consequence or anything you want to label as a consequence, only then will it actually do the job it's supposed to do. Otherwise, as Sue said, we're talking about punishment, and that's absolutely the opposite of any relational approach that's going to actually work.
There are a couple of things there that are scratching in my brain that I really liked. I think there is a bit of a misconception, isn't there, sometimes, that when we talk about a holistic or a nurture-led approach, that there is this assumption that we are giving out free passes for children, young people to do whatever they like, consequence-free. And, when we talk about consequences, we're talking about how do we put things back together, how do we make this right? But I think, if anything, a relational approach is led by more boundary and structure than any other approach that I've encountered. I think it's directly the opposite. But
Definitely.
Susie, you mentioned that curiosity, and I think one of the things that curiosity also helps us to do is manage our own expectations. I think sometimes one of the ways we find ourselves sort of clashing is when our expectations are just unfounded. I don't speak another language. I don't know if any of you guys do. But if you were to think about a language that you don't currently speak, and I asked you, do you speak that language? And you say no, and I say, well, tomorrow I'd like you to be able to speak that language. That would be a ridiculous assumption. It just wouldn't happen. It wouldn't be fair for me to expect that of you, because you might have never heard it, you might have never been taught it, shown it. But the comparison there is that, I might have never shown you the behavior that I think might help to keep you safe. You may have never experienced that for yourself, but I'm expecting you to just figure it out, to pull it from nowhere and get it right straight off the bat and keep getting it right. And if I couldn't do that to you in expecting you to be able to speak, perfect Mandarin, how could I do that to you when thinking about how you manage those great big feelings in what can be really tricky and vulnerable moments? It seems like a bonkers expectation, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I think with that as well, Jack, you know, as educators, whatever our role, we model, don't we? If a child finds something difficult or when we're teaching, we model. But why is it when it's around behaviour, all of a sudden we can act in a way that we don't want our children or our young people to do? Why is, that kind of shouting suddenly okay, or in really horrible situations, maybe using kind of, shaming systems. Why is that appropriate then? If we young people start shaming each other and writing their names up on boards and you've done this wrong, we wouldn't accept that, but we do from adults. So why do we have that discrepancy in how we're teaching our children certain developmental tools or strategies that they need? I think for me it goes back to, that disciple and discipline thing. It's about learning.
There is a real disconnect between actually modeling the behaviors that you're demanding. And I agree with you. And I've thought about this an awful lot. And it's almost like, is there an argument for saying that the more that we focus on academia and the pressure that is applied to schools, to those individual teachers, what have you, the more the default approach is about control? And it's actually, is it that that staff are actually scared or intimidated about the thought of actually possibly losing that control, which is, you have to let go of control if you want to develop a relationship, don't you?
Yeah, definitely.
And it could be that, I mean, that's just my philosophy. I don't know the science of it. So I just sort of go with what my experience has taught me over the years a little bit, really. But it's interesting thought.
So I'm just wondering, so we've talked a bit. I mean, I think it's no secret that Mo and I are huge advocates for a nurture-led approach. And we've talked about this idea, that what we're not doing is wrapping children or young people in cotton wool, but we're offering them tools in their toolkit to develop like an appropriate degree of resilience, an appropriate way to exist in the world almost. But I'm curious about, what's the impact of a nurture-led approach on staff well-being? We're talking a lot about the children, young people, as we rightly should, but I'm just curious about how do we think a nurture-led approach would impact staff and the teams in these provisions?
In the school, speaking to heads, I'm blown away by the positivity, energy in the schools I walk in where it's nurture led. A year ago, so I took some DFE bods to a school, and they couldn't believe how calm it was. And they asked the head teacher, um, "What's your, recruitment and retention like?" Because we know there's a big sort of retention crisis. And she was like, she looked really surprised at the question. She said, "Oh, we haven't recruited for over 2 years because we nurture our staff as well." And that's the language I've heard. Only a couple of weeks ago, I went to another school. The staff retention, they've been there for years. They have there's no chance these staff are leaving those schools, because one of the what I've heard is it brings the joy back to why you came into teaching. They're absolutely focused on, the academia as well, but they feel better equipped to support the children. They know the language. When we say all behaviours communication, the language you use, creating a safe base based around those 6 principles. They're creating an environment that the children are thriving, but they also want to be at. And very simplistically, whenever we go to a workplace or any environment, you want to feel safe, calm, happy, and you just want to have fun and enjoy yourself. Well, that's exactly those words I hear from those staff. And because they know how to manage behavior and understand where a child is coming from, they've taken the time to recognize stage, not age. They're able to support the children adequately, and then they enjoy they're enjoying their teaching as well. And seeing it in the schools, it creates a sort of a shared, compassionate lens for the whole school. And what's not to like about that? If we've got a recruitment retention crisis, and more, brilliant people are leaving the profession because they don't feel supported or, dare I say, nurtured themselves, then we need, why would we not sort of take the time and emphasis to do that? And I remember back from my teaching days, and I'm sure you guys, there are days when it's really, really hard and it's really tough. But if you've got no support, you don't know the language, you've got no resources. Going back to your language example, Jack, talking about learning a language and not getting the support. If you don't have the tools in your toolbox to be able to support, and you've been given that prescriptive, this is how you manage behavior, and going back to what you're saying about role modeling, and it's very punitive, and it's not going to work. You're not going to enjoy it because you're constantly tense. Your body language, your whole sort of manner, it's tense. Who wants to work in an environment like that? So going back to sort of your question, Jack, I've seen really positive impact in the schools that I've been able to see who have embedded nurture, and it's the whole school approach. But they also the positive knock-on effect I've also seen is with parents as well. When Susie, you were talking about community, I see that in the schools because they're using that same language with the parents. There's no them and us. It's this whole lens of let's create a whole nurturing ethos in everything and every adult that is interacting with our school environment. And there's beautiful relationships and conversations with parents. I've heard from parents as well in the school visits. And that's not, before nurture, it's a very different experience. And post nurture, it's a very different period. So I feel that the impact there's a really positive knock-on effect, which that golden thread runs all the way through every single aspect of the school.
I 100% agree. And Arti, you've just said like a lens. And for me, I think that is taking a nurturing approach is the lens in which you can develop some of these things. I think relationships with parents and carers is so important. And yes, of course, it can look different in primary and secondary. We understand that. But they are really important in our children's lives. So our relationship with them is critical. And I think the staff wellbeing thing, I think when I was maybe younger and a little bit naive in the system, it's all about the children first, 100%. Yes, it is. But our staff have to be okay for our children. And I will never be critical of schools. I think they are working under a system that is really, really difficult. And I am
Yeah.
absolutely I'm a proud teacher and I always will be. I think sometimes the work is really difficult, but I think ensuring that, you know, we invest in our staff will have a better impact on our children. And I remember when I started teaching, someone said to me, kind of you lead the ship, so to speak. The mood, the culture that you create within your classroom is how you steer that. Well, that goes at every level, doesn't it? The leadership of a school will steer that culture, that approach for staff. The local authority or the MAT will do that for the school, and that comes from where we are in terms of government agenda. So I think it's a really big picture, but I absolutely think that this example, Jack. So this podcast, you knew that I would probably be a little bit nervous about this. Now, what you did is you invested a little bit of time, a couple of messages. This is what you can think about. Da 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 da. Right. What you've done is you've helped me to try and be a better version of myself. That, for me, is what it's about. It's not about, well, just get on with it because that's your job. Actually, by investing a little bit, you get better. So, I think.
I agree with that. I forgot to mention earlier when we were talking about the 6 principles of nurture, when you were just talking now about leadership or that lens, Suze. At Nurture UK as a charity, we utilize those 6 principles in a work environment as well. So we're 100% a charity and trying to build those relationships and connections with your staff who are dotted around all over the country could be quite hard, but we have a very positive, nurturing culture. I love being part of the team. And we practice what we preach. So everything that we're saying to schools, we do that in our work environment as well. And I can see staff coming in who are new, and it might take them 6 months before they meet another colleague face to face, but they need to feel safe and they need to feel they've got the right tools to be able to do the job that they've been employed to do. And that's why, I can see that when you talk about well-being, I can see that running through the thread in terms of the staff team as well. So, which I love, which I think is great.
You're so right about that. Different jobs in schools, local authorities bring certain pressures and stresses. So, my work, I've had quite a long career, longer than I'd like it to be now, unfortunately. But when I started at Nurture UK, there was a bit of me that's like, are people genuinely this kind and supportive in this workplace? It was a massive transition for me, and it took me a while, and it absolutely is about embodying those values, because that's how you can then go on and disseminate that. And I think that's quite a sad state of affairs, isn't it? But that is how it was. It's like, wow, the support offered here to somebody who's new had a massive impact on me.
That's great to
That's
hear.
lovely. That's really lovely to hear. What I was going to add is it's almost put my main day job now is I'm a leadership coach, and I help people who have perhaps faced discrimination in their journey up the career ladder in schools and in education to actually be able to lead as their authentic and full selves and have that sense of belonging. And so you talk about equity and you talk about belonging and inclusion. And for some staff who have been marginalised or othered throughout their whole lives, and it's carried on in their careers in school, it's a really significant thing to come across a structure that enables them to be their whole self and be comfortable, and trying to find a way to navigate through that when there isn't a nurture approach ethos in the school is extremely challenging. And even me, having spent all those years as a head teacher and obviously as a Black woman, it was still something that I had to navigate even as the head, because a lot of the things that I wanted to bring in as part of that relational approach and that relational ethos, it was being received as, well, that's just more evident of you being different. Because actually they were so unused to the approach that it was becoming labelled as, this is what me as a Black woman was introducing, rather than just me being, without wanting to blow my own trumpet, a damn good leader, and considering my staff and focusing all my energy into making my staff feel good. It was really bizarre.
I sit here and recognise my privilege in many ways, but I think taking a nurturing approach is also about being able to sit in those conversations and to feel challenged, or to be able to be challenged, that psychological safety in a workplace to say, this isn't okay, what are we doing here, what do we need to do differently, who is consciously, subconsciously not being supported well enough, who is perhaps being, again, maybe not purposefully, but there is discrimination. I mean, if we think about some of our marginalised groups in school, some of our children who have faced discrimination, there's still a huge amount more we can do for them to ensure that sense of belonging. And they don't have the skills that we as adults have. So it's really important that those conversations are happening for staff so that we can be having them for our children as well.
I agree.
Arti, there was something that you said, and I really liked it. You talked about this idea of us and them, and there's a kind of workshop that I deliver, and it's kind of titled, closing down this idea of us and them. But I think one of the ways that it can cause us concern is often when we think about, if I put my sort of, educator hat on and I think about some of the days of training that I've thought about sitting through, some great, some, tiresome, but I think sometimes where approaches can fall short in their implementation is when they're only delivered as something that we do for those that we care and support. When something becomes this idea that that's what we do for the children, but it's not what we do for the adults. I mean, I did a piece of work with a school, and we were really on a bit of a transition to solid footing around a relational approach. And I witnessed this really interesting interaction between a member of staff who was doing their absolute utmost to sort of bind all their thinking together that we'd offered them. And the young person turned to her and said, "You won't be able to trick me into calming down."
Wow.
And I thought, that's really interesting that, what that young person has learned from seeing these approaches start to be embedded was that because it didn't feel real life, because it wasn't seen to be something that was very commonplace and that happened for everybody without kind of a transactional value or without a cost to achieve it, that it felt like something that had become a tool that adults could use to get their own way. When we think of, I've had my fair share of, I can see something's going on for you. I really want to help. And that, those moments where you get that young person look at you and go, I'm not falling for this. I don't care how many courses you've been on, this isn't going to work, because it doesn't offer that real human connection. And I think you're absolutely right with that idea of us and them, that, any approach, but a nurture-led approach has to be something that lives and breathes really organically. And it is for everybody without exception, without requirement to access.
I think that's probably the risk of when it is treated as an add-on rather than foundational, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why more schools should be doing this, because it's not for a small group of children, and or a small group of people. I think there's a big misconception that nurture is only for young children or for SEND.
Absolutely.
And that's not the case. So going back to the example you just gave, Jack, about people saying that you can't, trick me into calming down. It's clearly like it's just been it's not a language that's used across the board for everyone and everyone. And I think that sort of other misconception, it's the nice to have, people just need to stop thinking it's a nice to have rather than it's essential. Because every child, as a charity, we will say all children. We want to improve the life chances of all children because every child, adult could be nurtured. I think there's so much pressure on outcomes that the relational approach, training, language, ethos is just not given a time and day. So it becomes like a one course you do maybe once in your whole teaching career. And it should be given the same equity as other things that are happening in the school environments.
And that's a really interesting point. And Suze, maybe you can sort of answer this, I don't know, but the idea of that high pressure academic environment, how can that work then? How can that be embedded without it feeling like an add-on?
I think that idea of preparing teachers for the career that they're going into is really important, and not just teachers, the school community. And let's not forget, a whole school approach is not just about the teachers, and I use just in inverted commas. I mean, some of the most effective work I've seen in schools has been from people that maybe don't have a degree or a teaching qualification. So it's not about it's about being very aware that everybody has a role to play. But I think in terms of preparation for this career, there has to be a reality that the education system maybe hasn't changed as much as it could have done in the last decade or more, let's say. But society, what our young people are living with, experiencing, has. And, we just have to look at various data sets that will say we won't always know the young people that have experienced abuse. We won't always know the young people that are experiencing mental health difficulties. We won't always know the young people who have caring responsibilities. So there is a little bit of a risk by not thinking in this way. And there is a school that I work with, and again, there are certain phrases that we're at risk sometimes of using too loosely, and I think it's a real shame. But they are really working on that kind of the trauma-informed approach, trauma-informed way of working. And they said our approach to this is to assume that every young person may have experienced a traumatic event. Therefore, that's the approach we take, because we're not going to harm anybody by taking a nurturing approach, by being aware, by being kind of attachment aware about understanding kind of childhood experiences. It's not going to do any damage to any young people, but what it could do is really change the school experience for some of our more vulnerable young people. And I thought that's actually very brave in terms of doing that, because, as you know, academic pressure, the people that like to come and inspect schools, all of those things. But the outcome for those young people is that they are now in a setting where they feel safe and learning. There are a lot of prerequisite skills that are required, and there are a lot of risks that come with learning. And sometimes it's really difficult to do that if you don't feel you've got an adult that understands you. If you're really struggling to connect with that curriculum, then we're not going to be doing much to support that learning or doing as much as we can. I always think about some of the old Year 6 reading papers, where the two kids go caving or they go exploring up a mountain, and, the dog goes and whatever happens. Worked in an East London borough where a large majority of our children were living in high-rise blocks of flats. They hadn't seen outside the area that they lived. Those papers were so obscure. We weren't empowering them to be the best that they could. We were keeping our curriculum very much, this is what we've been doing. And like I said, it's not about being critical, but it is about understanding that the academic pressure, some of it can actually be alleviated by reducing those barriers to learning, by not trying to kind of keep going with this is the teaching, this is learning, this is the assessment process. Some of our children cannot sit within that. So by taking a different approach, we may actually be finding that our outcomes improve because of that, rather than are impacted negatively. If we think about brain development, taking a nurturing approach, it can, impact our cognitive, social, emotional, behavioural development in the same way that trauma and adversity can. So we want to shift that, thinking about those, and I'm not a neuroscientist. You could get people on here that are going to speak much more eloquently about neuroscience. But what we do know is that the younger we are, the less input is needed and the easier it is to create new neural pathways.
Absolutely.
Well, education's a great place to be doing that, because once we're into adulthood, it's a lot harder. So that is, that involves our learning, our curriculum learning, our social emotional learning.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think all good things, require some grit, some perseverance, sometimes a bit of a plastered smile on the days where we think, are we really sure this is starting to work? And that commitment to really embed and live and breathe things. And I do think there is a pressure on outcomes. And one of the hard things is that when we think about any kind of strategy, and I think that sounds quite cold, but I think we're often looking for data that we can say, well, we've implemented this and this is what it's produced. And I think when it comes to connection, when it comes to relationships and that genuine feeling of inclusion and belonging, that's really hard to measure. That's such an individual experience. How on earth would you put a kind of data set around that? So I think sometimes that can be a barrier for provisions. But Arti, you touched on something earlier that sometimes there is an assumption made that a nurture-led approach is for maybe a primary phase or younger children. And I'm a real firm advocate that is not the case. But I'm just curious about Nurture UK's work with secondary provisions and how that might look. And because I'm sure it will look and sound a bit different, but the principles underpin the same approach.
I do, yes. We're currently working in about 450 secondary schools now, and it's absolutely relevant. Adolescents still need the consistency and the connection. That doesn't change if you're suddenly 15 and from the age of 5, that doesn't change at all. And it can be easily embedded, the nurture approach into tutor systems and behaviour policies and pastoral care. I mean, like those exist as well. And the many of the schools that we've been working with have, produced powerful results when you talk about the academia. I've seen a secondary school using the Boxall profile, a tool to assess their children's and identify the needs. And they've been able to identify early support. I mean, there's one where they Boxall profile every single year 7 pupil. So they're able to put the school's needs and plans in place right from the beginning, and then they can follow the child all the way through. Now that, whether that's a primary school or a secondary school, if I didn't say secondary and took those words out, you would think that, it's the same implementation. So it can absolutely work. And it's about creating a safe base. There are vulnerable children, and, program, of the Netflix series and adolescents opens up a start. There's many schools, organizations, charities, consultants have been talking about this for a long time. It's sad that it takes a program, a TV series to get this back onto the government agenda, because it's something really important. We need to create a safe base, especially in these secondary school environments. So nurture can absolutely work. It's not, I said it right at the beginning, it's not rocket science, but you need to understand. So from a simplistic point, secondary schools could use the 6 principles of nurture to guide their whole school culture. They could invest in the training, and they could use Boxall profile to make the needs more visible. So you actually understand what the needs are and put planning in place. But what nurture does, it gives you the why. So many schools are talking about behaviour issues, or there's rising exclusions, reduction in attendance, but the kids don't want to be in school because they feel unhappy and unsafe. I'm not saying that's all schools, because schools have so much going on. But what the nurture approach does is give you the why. Why is that child behaving that certain way? Whether that child is 13, 15 or 5, it will give you, and then it'll give you the tools to do that. And I think, one of the things we do a lot of sort of public policy work and influencing work, and one of the things we're really sort of saying, wanting the government to do, is invest in staff training, give staff the training that they need they can adequately support their children, because then the staff will feel nurtured as well. And I would love to see nurture the norm across the school system. And even as a very simplistic starting point, if we could have Boxall profile in every school to identify those unmet needs which are not so visible. The visible, you will see the behavior in terms of But sometimes there are an array of children out there who have unmet needs because they're just not visible. And Boxall Profile is an assessment tool that allows the adult who knows a child very well, because that's what we always recommend, is to identify the barriers that that child has to their learning and how they can take them on the journey to get them. But also, what I really love about Boxall Profile is strengths based. It actually gives what that child is good at, because that's really the relationship. That's when you talked right at the beginning, Maureen, about connection. When we talked about what that connection is, that's what the child needs. We want to know, how do you connect to a child if you don't know what they're good at and what they're focusing just on the struggles? It's not a nurturing environment.
Absolutely.
It's that whole holistic. So going back to your question, Jack, I mean, the secondary schools can absolutely implement nurture in the school, in the secondary environment. We've seen it. I've spoken to teachers, and there's one example of a secondary school that I was talking, spoke to us, and they said, I genuinely think if we hadn't done this when we did, which is implemented nurture, at least 2 of my year 10, 11 boys would be in prison now.
Wow.
And another said, our attendance is better than ever and our exclusions are lower than they've ever been. I feel we're much richer and stronger as a school as a consequence of nurture. Now, these are secondary schools.
And that's so incredible, isn't it? I think there's such a need. I mean, I think back to my time in secondary school and the kind of experiences that I was having, the environment I was in, and that great big shift in who I was, how I experienced the world, those great big changes that happen at that really vital part of life. I was really fortunate to have a single member of staff who I was really deeply connected to, that kind of tethered me through that whole experience. But if that approach was normalized, that was the consistent, even to bridge that primary secondary transition. If we went from the same consistent approach at both phases, I think that would offer so much support. But they're really those examples, 2 young people possibly in prison. The power, if that doesn't sum up the power of connection and a relational approach that underpins those foundations, as we've said a few times, I don't know what will.
It's easy to become kind of a little bit lost in what people are saying, like the buzz phrases that go out, but actually having like a trusted adult, somebody that what is 100% kind of got that unconditional positive regard for you, that care for you. I don't think we can ever underestimate the importance. I mean, it's Rita Pearson's TED Talk all over, isn't it? But I think there are a couple of things. I think that understanding of meeting need, if we think about, our youth justice system and the disproportionate number of young people who've got speech and language communication needs, these are things that we can still be working and we can still be picking up. We see this shift a little bit from primary to secondary, where it may have been identified as possible speech and language, and then it becomes a behavioural thing. And that trajectory is really different. And I'm not going to, this isn't a sweeping statement, but I think it's so hard to access some of the support services that are needed, or those specialist services. But I think that transition, and it's age old, isn't it? But there is something from 6 to 7 that we still aren't quite nailing for some of our children. And I think one of the things, I mean, I talk as a professional, but also as a parent of a 15-year-old, who I won't talk about because I don't have her permission to, but I do know that her experiences in school and her connection to her teachers absolutely has an impact on her enjoyment and her engagement in lessons. But I think Andrew Curran's video on what happens during adolescence was a real eye-opener for me. If we think, again, just going back to the biology, what is happening in adolescent bodies with dopamine and serotonin and all these spikes and dips, sometimes that we see that play out. And again, think about ourselves. If they haven't seen that, if they don't know that, well, of course they're going to think someone that might be fronting up is, being aggressive or trying to be difficult. There could be all sorts of other stuff going on for them. And I think it's quite interesting, if you talk about somebody being a nurturing person, they've got a really nurturing nature, you think of that as generally we think of that as quite a positive thing. You think, why don't we think about that in the same way as education then? Why is it that's it's a bit fluffy? It's not. It's about how we are supporting people.
Absolutely, and you've highlighted there something I wanted to bring out as well. So it's the idea of brain and development, and When young people hit secondary school age, I think there are some really key things that as educators, and as you're right, quite rightly saying, not just teachers, but as educators and in schools, there are some key facts about development that if we just keep reminding each other of those facts, it will automatically remove the emotion and the sort of the blame and the power struggle that can infect our approach with young people. You know, things like the fact that these young people are reaching a developmental stage where their brains and their psyche are first testing out the need to be separate as adults. The need to be separate. So that will bring with it being secretive. That will bring with it, and also for the adults as well. The adult brains are designed to interact with teenage brains in a way that almost rejects them because we're preparing them for the world. And it's really simple stuff like that that you just think, people think that schools are this bubble where that doesn't matter. You know, and I just want to point out, is it that they're being terrible or is it just that they're being 14?
Yeah.
I mean, the mum me and the professional me might have very different responses to that. But no, absolutely. What is happening in that nervous system? What is going on in absolutely with all of that? What's the word? Kind of developmentally necessary kind of changes that are happening for them, so that they can go into adulthood, can you know, make risks, make choices. Those, you know, some of the things that
Isn't that the time when nurture is needed the most?
Exactly. Yeah,
absolutely.
definitely.
That curious lens, you know, I think of anger being one of those really highly misunderstood presentations. Often, our angry children, and I use inverted commas, they are covering up some really strong emotions, aren't they? Or is that a response to something really strong, whether that be shame, fear, guilt, embarrassment, horrible emotions to have. What they need is empathy and that sense of understanding. I see you, I hear you, this is tough, not something that makes them feel worse. And again, I think sometimes just applying how we respond to a young person, is that how we would want someone to respond to us? Because if it isn't, then maybe that isn't what they need either.
So maybe a question for you, Arti. One of the things that I'm thinking about, and my maybe professional knowledge of Nurture UK is this idea around nurture groups. And I'm just thinking about, for those that maybe haven't yet had the
Mm.
joy of getting to Nurture UK or nurture groups, could you tell us a bit more about what are nurture groups?
Well, so nurture groups are short-term interventions for children with social, emotional, mental health needs, and it's about providing a structure which is predictable environment with strong relationships. And we often sort of suggest nurture groups for those children who have particular high level of social emotional needs. And the idea is always it's short term. They part of this, back into the main classroom. They're not sort of isolated. It's not saying these group of children stay isolated the whole sort of that year or that term. It's about short term bursts, but it's about creating a predictable environment. And we often suggest it for those children who have got particular adverse childhood experiences, high levels of trauma. Nurture as a whole, I think we sort of 2018, 19 as a charity, prior to that, we very much focused on nurture groups. We used to be called Nurture Group Network. But after our Now You See Us report, it helped us to realise that nurturing requires all children, so across all boards. So we often play more of an emphasis now on the National Nurturing, I suppose, schools program, where it's a whole school approach to nurturing and all children are supported. However, nurture groups is for those with particularly highly identified with higher needs, where they need to have a bit more of a nurturing environment. And there's a particular structure and how nurture groups are set up in terms of our sort of training and the accreditation. I know there's different types of nurture rooms or nurture groups across the country, but the Nurture UK training is specifically accredited in, and there's a particular way they need to be set up in order that the all six principles of nurture are completely embedded across that sort of environment.
In my brain, I almost feels, because you're right, we run the risk of things becoming tokenistic if they're just deployed to kind of one particular group.
Absolutely.
But that nurture group almost feels like a really lovely way to kind of transition those young people that maybe need it a little bit more than others, perhaps, into that wider whole school approach.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Otherwise, sort of main emphasis is that whole school approach. And that's, we want to, I always say hashtag nurture the norm.
I'm going to get that on a t-shirt, Arti.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
Can I order a tote bag? That's what I'd prefer.
I've got so many tote bags. I think a teacher would do me well.
So we like to, as we sign off, we like to give our listeners practical things that they can do and practical things that they can put into place. So, Suze, can I ask you, give us a key action that listeners can take away that they can perhaps pick up from tomorrow that will make their environment and their setting more nurturing?
I think there are a couple of things that are quite. It's a massive topic. It's so much that we can and could do, but maybe some things people can go away and start thinking about. One of the things that I suppose I want to address is this idea that regulation and supporting young people to regulate isn't a reward. If they're kind of great, if they're in their brains, their emotional response, their nervous system is firing off, allowing them what they need is not a reward. I think if staff are having a really difficult day, they, I don't know, made a mistake, they've taught something wrong, they've responded in a way, their go-to might be go and have a cigarette, go and have a coffee, go and have a cup of tea, go and talk to their peers. They're doing that because that's what they need to do. If we start saying, oh no, you can't do that, that's got to be, you're in trouble, you can't do that. Actually, we wouldn't, because we know that people need to find a way of managing those emotions. So I think that culture of being outside kicking a football as a reward, if we can review that, I think that's a really big thing. I think the use of language and how we talk about what's happening is really important. How we think about our young people, our families, I think is another thing. If we can empathetically challenge our thinking, sometimes is a child kicking off, or are they distressed? Are they attention seeking, or are they attachment seeking or connection seeking? Are we talking about situations where a child is making really poor choices and they've done this and they've done that, or are they in a state of dysregulation and are finding it really difficult to bring themselves back? I think sometimes thinking about the language we use in our culture might be something. I think for leaders in schools, it might be about understanding, auditing, how much do our staff know about child and adolescent development? Like you said, Maureen, there are some really key things that come with part being a child and an adolescent that if we don't know them, we can't work with that. So perhaps there's something about reviewing what our staff are aware of. I think it's also about questioning the rationale behind some of our responses or our decisions that we make as a school. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose? Does this meet the needs of our young people? Absolutely holding on to that professional curiosity. I want to say it's Bruce Perry. It's one of these amazing people, it's Bruce Perry or Laurie DeSotos, but it's this idea of, not thinking, well, why did they do that? But that what has happened for them to respond like that? What are they trying to communicate with me? And holding that empathetic, curious lens, even when things are difficult, because, we can all sit in this room and say, yep, we need to be nurturing, we need to be attachment aware, we need to be trauma informed. And we can all do that. But when it's difficult, that's when we are challenged. So what are our support systems? Who have we got? What is our culture around supporting each other when things get difficult?
Yeah.
I feel like you've just reeled off the 6 principles of nurture, Suze. They just need to embed the 6 principles.
I love it. I think you're absolutely right. I think of my friend, gorgeous lady called Karen Harris. She's an absolute light in my life. And she really simply puts it into what she calls the 3 W's. How do we wait, watch, and wonder? And what does that look like? Where does that live and breathe? And again, that'll be on a t-shirt and a tote bag, I'm sure, somewhere. Arti, Suze, I just want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for being so generous in sharing your thinking. I know that there'll be a huge amount to take away from this, and from our perspective, it's such a joy when you find those people that you really connect with, that you get to spend some really lovely time just thinking and thinking about what this could look like and the impact that this could have. So, thank you so much.
Absolutely. And from my point of view, I was a head for 21 years, and I walked away because I no longer felt that that was what was giving me the same spark. And when I have conversations like this, that almost make me want to think, I want to go back and do this again. And so, and that's a real measure of whether or not the message that you've been giving out is really, really hit a nerve. It really has. And so thank you so much. I won't be going back and doing it again. Thank you for reminding me of all that was good about my time in education, and what continues to be good for those of us, those people who are still actively working in it. So thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.